Thank you, and we're looking forward to hear from you. You can either write or you can raise your hand, whatever is easiest for you. I can see that
we have the first question.
Has a question, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, all the three gentlemen, Dylan, Roy, and Hyman. Been really enlightening to hear all of that. I would have actually had a question on the illustration of how it is done in terms of identifying the relevant products, but I understand that this is done through the publication, notification, and the inquiry point in terms of the identification of goods as to whether they are being restricted or not. I have another question, and it just regards what Simon just mentioned in terms of the licensing. You mentioned something on restriction that might be there in terms of licensing of COVID-19 vaccines. I don't know if I called that well. I'd be grateful if you could just enlighten me a little bit on that, on how countries would impose licensing on COVID-19 vaccines and use that as a form of restriction. Thank you.
Thank you, Tejaswi. Maybe Roy or Dalan, you want to take the first question?
If I understood correctly, you were asking how do we know which products are being restricted, correct?
Yes, and then how can you decipher from each product? How can you show the differentiation between each product being restricted?
Yeah, this we know based on two sources, as we were explaining before. In like 2/3 of the cases, we have received notifications from the members, and they tell us which is the national legislation, decree, guideline, or anything else which is in place. So those we can actually search and download. Many times they even have links where you can check those pieces of legislation. Then they also provide information in terms of the products which are covered by the different type of measures. So for example, when we were looking at the food or the face masks, these notifications are usually quite detailed in terms of the information that is being provided. So we take it directly from there. In the case of the trade monitoring report, if it has not been notified, we do a similar type of exercise where we go and we check the national legislation. And very important here, we don't rely so much on newspaper type of clips only to find out that the measure exists. But if we want to see what really has been implemented by the member, we would look at official websites by the members.
Thanks, Roy. So to give you a concrete example about those export authorization mechanism, licenses, whatever you want to call it, in terms of WTO language, whenever something requires a license and the license is not given automatically to export, then we consider this a non-automatic license. And for example, the European Union has put in place a measure which they call an authorization mechanism for exports of COVID-19 vaccines just last week. So this is one example of those export restrictions for those COVID-19 vaccines.
And perhaps just to add, and then they are important because if you do not have the license, then you cannot export the product, right? And then we mentioned the European Union, but they are not the only ones. We have, I think, about 5 or 6 members that we know already have in place export licensing schemes or full bans on vaccines.
Okay. Are there any other hands? Would anybody jump in directly in the discussion? I see a lot of questions on Pradeep's face. We have a few questions also on the chat.
Perhaps, Simon, there is one I wanted to refer to. I think this one is by Brian Benjamin. And then he is asking, the WTO can determine a way to have the work done during COVID-19 to media houses in its member countries, including major media houses. Be proactive in reaching out to the media. Yes, but then the problem from the WTO side is, remember, we are a member-driven organization. That means we can only do what the members have given us a mandate to do. So we do have a mandate to do some of this work, as I was telling you before, in the context of the trade monitoring report, but then we cannot really exceed our mandate and go beyond that. Now, there are some organizations that, of course, they are not member-driven. They can collect information as much as they want, and some of them have been quite active in terms of gathering information from all sorts of sources to quickly release this information, right? So from the WTO side, I think we typically try to err on being correct, even if that takes a bit more time to come out with some of these analysis.
Yeah, there's also going in this direction as well. There's a question by Mohamed Abdul Samad Al-Azad that he asks, how does the WTO verify the information it receives? And is there a communication with the country that resorted the restrictive measure, or is there a specific mechanism? So essentially, there's two ways. There's the trade monitoring scheme, and the colleagues from this section at the WTO, they have this big list of measures available, but they don't do any detailed analysis about the measure. They don't know, for example, what is the WTO justification of those measures. It's really only a factual statement that there is a certain measure in place. And the section, they contact all the WTO members that have those measures in place to verify that this information they have is correct. On our side, when we talk about quantitative restrictions of export, such as export restrictions, the member itself actually is required to send those notifications to the WTO. So the information is of the origin of the member itself. So the member is the owner of the information. Do you want to add something to your question? Oh no, this is somebody else, sorry. I hope this
Simon,
answered the question.
Simon, perhaps one thing I wanted to add is just to show you very, very quickly, and then we come back to the questions, is that in the WTO webpage, which is WTO.org, we have this section specifically dealing with COVID-19. And if you go here to this section that says full details, you are actually going to be able to access a huge amount of information. Most important part I advise you to look is this one, which you have on the left, which basically the site has grown so much from last year that now typically all of these have a specific section. So for example, if you want to see the WTO reports we have been referring to, you have it in here. If you would like to see these trade monitoring measures that we have been making reference to, you can also find them here. If you would like to have and contact an inquiry point from another member to ask a question on a specific issue, we also have that information here on the notifications and so on and so forth. In fact, the problem, I think, is that we have so much information that it's sometimes a bit challenging to know exactly where to go to find it.
Thanks, Roy. Pradeep, you're next on our list. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Pradeep from Nepal. Thank you for your insightful presentation. Yes, indeed. I went through the report you have just shown in the screen. My query is, how can we LDC like Nepal be benefited from WTO Secretariat to get COVID vaccine timely and in a transparent manner? Thank you.
Roy, you're muted.
Sorry, 1 year and I keep making the same mistake. No, I was just saying that the WTO is not really involved in the distribution of the vaccines. This is being organized through several different schemes, one of them being COVAX, and some other schemes that are trying to ensure that there is an equitable distribution of the vaccine around the world. So when it comes to the vaccine, there's lots of steps and elements which are involved. The world distribution through international step is just one of them, but then there are many other organizations, institutions which are involved. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat where we did a whole study on the vaccine production and distribution, which I think is going to be quite interesting for you, just in case if you have not seen it.
Thank you.
Yes, we have Mohammed Ziaur Rahman from Bangladesh.
Thank you. So my question is that what about the present situation? As you know, some of the developing countries like India and South Africa have a proposal regarding the LDC, TRIPS exemption for this COVID-19 situation for the developing countries. So what will happen if they will get this exemption, and what will happen for the LDC countries? Is there any possibility for the LDC countries for trade erosion or any impact on their current situation? Thank you.
If I may perhaps start, I think that's a very good question. And on Friday, on session 2 of this module, we will be reviewing some of the proposals that have been made for the way forward. So not the existing mechanisms, but the proposals that have been made for future functions or developments in the WTO. However, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, we are only focusing on trading goods aspects during this week. So we are deliberately leaving out services and intellectual property developments during the pandemic. So we are not covering that, but you are right. There is a proposal that is being discussed. And of course, it's drawing a lot of attention from the media and from some governments, but I would feel more comfortable if my colleagues working in the IP division perhaps would comment on these developments as opposed to us. Because as team, we don't manage that proposal and those discussions. Would anyone else have other questions? We have still maybe another 5 minutes if anyone has more.
From the chat, there's just one quick question about import restrictions, whether there were import restrictions as a result of COVID-19. And we've seen this in particular in the beginning of the crisis. We saw that a few countries had import restrictions on live animals, for example. But as it became pretty soon clear that that's not a major driver of spreading the disease, so we haven't seen this being for long around. Then there was another question.
Sorry, Simon, to add on that, I think some of that also is explained if you saw one of the charts I showed with the SPS measures, right? So at some point it was clear that the eventual transmission of some of these things could be prevented by taking certain specific type of actions. And I think by now the trade in many of these, let's say, live animals or some, for example, meat, fish, some of these things that you read from time to time, if there is some form of additional measure implemented, typically it's an SPS measure, and then it has been notified through the mechanisms we discussed before.
Another question was, what if a country continues to use those restrictive measures after the pandemic ends? What are the consequences that the country could face, especially if the reasons behind those measures can't be verified? So essentially, like if any of those trade measures, this could become a dispute if another member raises this issue. So this could be one of the consequences.
Yeah, well, perhaps here, Simon, just to add, it's interesting. I don't know if you saw when Simon was making the presentation describing the carve out that we have in Article 11, paragraph 2, in terms of the critical food shortages and other essential products. These measures are meant to be temporary, but then we do not have a definition of what temporary is. And then does it mean that, you know, it's also probably linked to the crisis? So probably during the duration of the crisis, you are still allowed to have it if the conditions that gave birth to the measure are still there. But then this is something that is not very clearly defined. So if you had any disagreement amongst the members on how to interpret and whether some of those measures had to be removed or not, this will probably need to be discussed either bilaterally with the, by the members in a committee, or if it really, let's say, gets out of hand and the stakes are quite high, it might end up in a dispute where the issue would need to be interpreted.
Okay, I think we are with we have Lolibeth. Please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. So thank you very much for all the very informative presentations, and we are very well, it's very useful to know the different measures that different members countries have taken as far as trading goods are concerned. But overall, and you've seen all these notifications and all these procedures in place. And I guess to a certain extent, the COVID really challenged and probably presented several challenges to WTO and member states as well. Would you, in your assessment, say that the WTO procedures, processes, notifications, and the discipline sufficiently address the needs and given the enough flexibility for member states to implement national measures on this matter? Thank you.
Well, perhaps to reply quickly to that one, I think what you can see is that members were clearly taking actions. Clearly, they were, let's say, providing information to the WTO. Many as notifications, some others perhaps not notifications, but through the trade monitoring type of report. Now, the question is whether the rules that we have are sufficient or not, and that's something that you have different opinions. So if you read, for example, in the academia or even in the context of the different committees, you have proposals by members who would like precisely to discuss this, right? Were the rules enough? Are there best practices? Do we need to do something different? Do we need rules which are different? And then you even have some proposals. For example, I think there's one led by Singapore and other countries where they would actually like to exempt, for example, the exportation of certain products from export restrictions if they are bought, for example, through the COVAX type of initiative or some other of these elements, right? So there is these proposals out there, but for the moment, there's no agreement on whether things have to be changed or not. So this is something that probably will be discussed this year. So it's very important for you to get involved and follow what these discussions are leading to. I think Osman, if you want, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Roy. I hope you are hearing my voice
yes,
appropriately. First, let me thank you very much for the very comprehensive and insightful presentations made by our colleagues from the WTO. I have a question regarding the so to say restrictions on exports or imports. For example, we see most of the countries required some measures for entering into their territories or entering into their states at the borders. For example, we saw during the pandemic that some of the countries require PCR testing before 72 hours before the entering into their territory. Even for drivers who are transporting the goods into their territories. So can we see that those measures, or so to say restrictions for the service providers such as drivers, are compatible with WTO rules, and can we say that they are justifiable within the context of WTO on the restrictions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Osman. That's a very interesting question. I don't even know where to begin. So when somebody is getting into the territory of another member, typically there are, just like goods, there are all sorts of rules and technical regulations that determine how this has to take place, right? So for example, you have immigration type of procedures. So you need to make sure that the person has the right to come in. And then you typically have sanitary protocols that are in place as well. And this has existed for many, many years. If I can give you one example, if you are going to many countries in Africa or Latin America or Asia, you need to demonstrate that you have a vaccine against yellow fever or some of these other diseases, because they want to make sure that this is not going to be a problem for the person coming in, but also for the country that is receiving the person, right? So many of these health protocols that were put in place are not really about the trade in goods itself. It's more about the means of transport of let's say, that are bringing the goods, right? So for example, there were lots of problems for air cargo. So you have the airplanes arriving, so you have the pilot and the crew, and then typically the same pilot and crew would need to take the plane somewhere else. But then if as soon as they arrive, they are put into quarantine, oops, all of a sudden there's a plane that is completely out because nobody can actually operate these apparatus, right? Same thing happened with the ships. So when they were arriving to the port, you know, typically they, at some point, even if, for example, one of them was having COVID, even if the person could remain isolated in its own room or somewhere else, they were not even allowed to come to port and then unload the merchandise. In terms of land transport, some of the issues like the ones you were mentioning, right? If you have a truck driver, so the goods, everything has been done, the goods have been given the release, but then the driver cannot continue, then there is a problem because the goods are stuck at the border, right? So I think initially this was a very big, important problem. And then at some point, countries realized that they had to do something about it. The same thing happened, for example, imagine if you have to close the customs in one border because there was one case of COVID. So what happens if the people actually dealing with the customs procedures are not protected? It could be catastrophic, because if you completely have to close one border crossing point, then that means that you are isolated in terms of import, export through that particular point, right? So what happens is in many countries, they began having special rules, special health protocols for purposes of what they deem to be essential workers. And then there was even calls from the G20, for example, to, let's say, take action and do something special to allow trade to continue flowing. So this was something that was quite important, I think, around April, May, when it became clear that the normal health protocols should not really be applicable to those operating the means of international transport. But this is something that has happened mostly outside of the WTO. We have not really had discussions about this, I think, for the moment in the WTO. If we were to have a discussion, it would be probably more considered to be a services type of issue in terms of the movement of people across borders, rather than a goods discussion. I hope to have answered your question.
Thank you very much, Roy.
I don't know what happened to my colleagues. I think they lost connection. But if you have any question and I am able to help you, I will be happy to do it. That does not seem to be the case. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. This is a very innovative way of having some of these discussions. So we hope that we were up to the task and that you actually liked the contents we were discussing today. So we will continue then on Friday, where we're going to be discussing now the trade facilitating type of measures, plus also some of the proposals that have been made to move forward and take some form of action in the context of these measures. Sorry, I was too quick. Sorry, I cannot see your name. It just says Apple MacBook, but if you can introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Yes, hello, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Abdul from Afghanistan.
Hello, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, I had a question regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on different levels of economies of the world, big economies and also backward countries like Afghanistan. Thank you.
Sorry, I understood you wanted us to talk about the vaccines in the context of developed countries and developing countries, but I didn't quite get the question. So perhaps if you can repeat.
My question was regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on different levels of the economies of the world, the big economies like America, China, Japan, or other countries, and also on the backward countries like Afghanistan, less developed countries.
But your question has to do with the distribution of the vaccine.
Not distribution of the vaccine, just the impacts, the negative impacts of the COVID-19 on the different levels of the economies.
Yeah, on this, I think there is a common understanding around the world. Yeah, sorry, I thought I was muted. Yeah, I think there's a common understanding around the world that the vaccine is crucial for all countries, right?
The number of cases in Afghanistan was about 14,000 cases. But the negative impacts of this virus was much more than the development countries. So if I am sure that if America or Japan or China had the same cases in their country, the impact of the COVID-19 was much less than Afghanistan. So I'm sure that there's not a direct relation between the impacts of COVID-19 between the level of the economies of the world. I hope if you could give,
I get your question, but this is something that we have not really studied. I think in terms of, let's say, overall.
It's just a general question about the impacts of COVID-19. So I was hoping if you could answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah, just remember in terms of the WTO, what we look is mostly in terms of the trade aspects of the economy, right? So we look at how goods cross across the borders. We look at the services, and we also look about some of the intellectual property aspects which are related to trade, right? So in terms of the overall impact on the economy, I think we all understand that it's quite big, and for all countries, right? I think that's why it's so important, and we are all desperately trying to make sure that the vaccination is as quickly as possible. But then, of course, vaccinating 3 billion people is not easy. Production has to be done properly, and most importantly, it has to be done in a safe way to make sure that the vaccine really works and we do not end up in a bigger problem than before. We want to make sure that people trust the vaccine, right? So there are lots of steps that have to be taken. So I just wanted to say that in the chat, I put this link that describes the whole vaccine value chain. Now, in terms of economic impact, I think if you are interested on this issue, I think the World Bank has done quite a lot of work in this particular area. One thing we can do is we can check and see if there are studies that have been done in this respect. And then on Friday, if we find something, we will be happy to come back to you and then share some of those when we begin, if that's okay. Would that be okay? Yes?
Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you very much again. And then we see you back on Friday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.